series. Actually, this one is our last Colloquium for the semester, but you know that we will have more next semester and more. And please support the Colloquium by attending Colloquium and also happy hour and related events, and they really appreciate it. And before I introduce our host and then the speaker, I just wanted to ask you if you would have any announcements for the department. Because I don't have specific announcements today, but if you have any announcement for the event, then you can do. Yeah.
So, just a reminder, next Thursday is our Texas Water Symposium. So this is a quarterly event put on by the Hill Country Alliance, but we help host it every 2 or 3 years or so. So this Thursday is particularly timely and relevant. It's about flooding in Texas. This will be the 4th one I've been to now. They're all great. You hear from the experts. We have Raymond Slade will be one of the panelists who we had as a program speaker a couple years ago. Dr. Earl will be giving the welcome. So please, everybody, come. It's, like I said, it's a great learning opportunity. It's next Thursday, 7 p.m. at the LBJ Teaching Theater at the Student Union. Okay? Any questions?
You have to sign up or pay to go to that, or you just show up?
I'll cover your costs. There's no cost. You just show up. Okay. They'll even validate parking if you're coming in at time on your parking space. And then alumni reunion, April 27th. Mentioned last time, you don't put on your calendars. Put on your calendars. I'll announce it every time we get together. April 27th.
Yeah, so just a reminder, we have the Thanksgiving potluck coming up soon. That's not this coming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that, the 20th. So there'll be sign-up sheets in the office for everyone, but grad students, please come out and sign up to contribute something. It's always a really good time. You get to just share a meal with colleagues and professors and get to try a bunch of different dishes and things like that. So let us know if you have any questions. Reach out to myself or Mile. Yeah, put that on your calendars as well, the 20th. Thanks.
Okay, then please join me welcoming Dr. Sasha here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Clio Andris.
Hey folks, I'm super happy you decided to show up for this wonderful talk, so that's a personal thank you from me. It's a pleasure of mine to introduce Dr. Andris today. Dr. Andris is an old friend and a very good colleague, and she does outstanding research. We had a little bit of a disagreement about how to do the introduction. I had 2 pages of text. She told me I'm allowed 3 sentences. So in terms of what we agreed on, Dr. Clio Andris is in her 5th year at the Department of Geography at the Pennsylvania State University. She's an assistant professor there. She serves as the director of the Friendly Cities Lab, which is an interesting initiative started just by her, and their focus is data-driven love for community, which is one of the better mottos I have seen in my life. Clio received her PhD from MIT with a focus on urban information systems, and she did, well, she said she did 1 postdoctoral work. She did 3 different postdocs in the field of complex systems. Now that's all that I was allowed, but the one thing that I'm going to sneak in while she's not looking is that Clio is the gold finalist for the 2015 Information Visualization Award. It's an international competition called How Information is Beautiful, for her work on visualization of the rise of partisanship in the US House of Representatives, which might be particularly relevant given all of the recent trivial events. So I'll cut it short at this point, otherwise I'll be killed later. So I think it's safe to say that on behalf of the entire community, we welcome you to Texas State, and we're extremely happy that you decided to come and bless us with this place.
I don't think I'm ever going to get to the top of an introduction like that. Thank you guys very, very much for having me. I've had a wonderful time here, and I'm very, very happy to be a part of this. So without further ado, today my talk is called Interpersonal Relationships in Geographic Space. Thank you. So I run the Friendly Cities Lab. It is an initiative at Penn State which has graduate students and many undergraduates working towards a common goal. So we have 4 major goals in Friendly Cities. One is to develop social flow theory. Social flows are defined as the flow of people, information, and thoughts and proclivities between two places. We try to build social flow theory that examines why traces occur and how they affect place and people. We create categories, classifications, analytical methods, and caveats for understanding these interpersonal transactions within a GIS environment. We also work on social distance. So from social flow theory, we build models of social distance. We're hoping to find the hidden connections that we can't see on a map by developing a new measure of social distance. So social distance is defined as the strength of social flows between places. Social distance can be short for highly connected, distant places. For example, two faraway places with similar industries, like perhaps an oil rig and place in North Dakota where the oil industry is very booming, even though they're very far apart, they might have a very near social distance. Or places that are very close by, but don't have a lot of connectivity between them. For example, like two segregated neighborhoods that are right near each other, but they don't have a lot of ties going back and forth. We study what drives social distance, so political and administrative boundaries, natural boundaries, institutions, language, religion, social networks, or things like immigration status. We also look at spatial networks. We look beyond measuring places by simply demographics such as race and income to measure their spatial connectivity patterns. So we're interested in looking at places by how they connect to other places, what distances, at what distance bands they connect, and the diversity of those connections. So we look at the geometric extent to which places are connected to all other places. And this adds an extra layer of information that reflects culture, diversity, and idea flow, the way that traditional census data can't necessarily do. We automate this process with digital technology. And finally, we're verging into a very fun field of love, friendship, family, and relationships in the city. So my background is in urban planning, and so the city has always been a really interesting test bed for things. And interpersonal relationships are a very, very important part of the city that I believe are very undermapped. So we help urban planners plan for love and romance by finding amenities that best support personal relationships. Parks, bars, Tinder, kayaking. We ask how socialization differs by what else or who else is accessible, how relationships are maintained over changing geographic circumstances, and how the landscape changes depending on the type and salience of local and distant relationships. So we're working on these big four types of research focuses. And none of them are really complete yet, but these are the research questions that we're asking. So luckily, today there's a lot of research on big data. The way for visualization purposes. Up at the top here, we can see Facebook friendships going between different places in the London area. And it's a really cool way to take a look at what if a center city is connecting to other center cities, or if a suburb is connecting to the inner city, or if they're connecting peripherally. And that's one big way that big data has been used. Another one is to look at semantics and places and different topics and where different topics are being taught about or being spoken about. This is a map called Twitter Trends Map, and it maps different words that were used frequently on Twitter, geolocated to the places where the tweet happened. So that's a way that big data research is being used. Another way that's very interesting for us is population detection. So looking at who has different devices in places, counting the smartphones and counting crowds, etc., in different locations, and then using this as a proxy for understanding how many people might be there. And then lastly, we're trying to look at things like, or big data research is looking at things like check-ins and times, so how points of interest are being utilized. This map over here takes a look at whether certain parts in London are being looked at or are being visited by Foursquare tourists, who would be in the blue, or by local check-ins, who would be in the red. So looking at how the city is used by different people and how they're using points of interest. So within this big data and location-based social network data, there isn't a lot of research on the relationships that are being made and exactly how these relationships are being constructed. So that's something that we're very interested in. And luckily, there's a lot of evidence about the relationship between two people, professional, friend, family, and romantic ties. So there are emails flying over our heads every single second that have a lot of great text in them. There's SMSs, so text messages. There's social media that we all know about. There are phone calls, and phone call and call data record initiatives have been very, very prominent in this type of research. And then there's still letters, cards, postcards, that the volume of mail and packages going between residences and going between businesses can tell us a lot about where salient relationships are. And then there's an et cetera category here that is on sort of the more cutting edge. For example, what Alexa might be collecting, or knowing that you were in the same restaurant as someone because you both used your credit card there, or seeing that your phones came onto the same Wi-Fi, or even the Roomba, the little moving vacuum, is now apparently collecting data on the inside of your house and sending the blueprints back to a server. So those are all interesting new initiatives, but the point is that there's a lot of data out there. So the way that I'm seeing geographers being able to use interpersonal relationships logically is in a cause and effect sort of way. And this is all just based on common sense. So it's clear that relationships interact with geographic space, but we lack ways to measure and how much. But these are questions that we should be asking. So we have interpersonal relationships, and then we have our spatial dynamics. And we're saying that interpersonal relationships cause spatial dynamics. Here are some examples. Community migration forms ethnic enclaves. So like chain migration. It happens a lot of times because of interpersonal relationships. You know someone and it creates a chain, and then all of a sudden you have an ethnic enclave somewhere because they moved for relationships. A husband might move for a wife's new job. The husband might not have really preferred that area, or they doesn't have it in his industry, but his wife had a job there, so he's going there because of a relationship. A sister follows a brother's college choice. Family and friends fly to a wedding. So relationships are creating these dynamics. And then vice versa, the spatial dynamics and what we give people to work with as geographers and planners also will have an effect on the types of relationships we can have. So urban restaurants allow colleagues to meet for coffee. A new school district creates parent relationships. Sometimes these school districts, the boundaries can be a little bit arbitrary, but somebody who lives right across the boundaries might not meet each other and get to circulate internally as much as people who are in that one school district. Improved subway lines allow the elderly to visit friends, and visa and passport laws can hinder family unification. We see those types of things a lot in the news more and more these days. So how we are planning things and the policies that we're creating definitely have an impact on the relationships and vice versa. So this is something I developed because I wasn't really sure at what scale the interpersonal relationship existed in geography. I can't really see it very easily. It's not necessarily a row in data that I'm getting. And a relationship is a really, really hard thing to actually put your finger on. And it's a private thing oftentimes. So I was working on scaling relationships in my complex systems postdoc. And so I developed a way to kind of look at what scales might the relationship possibly exist. So at first point, it exists in our minds. So we have cognition and we have social cognition, and we think about our relationships quite a bit. That's something that geographers certainly study social cognition, or spatial cognition that is, but I don't think we've necessarily tapped into the more of the AI version of that yet. We have it at the dyad level. So communication specialists study relationships at the dyad level. For example, like relationship maintenance strategies and how what you say affects the other person, and marriage studies, etc., and family studies. That's all at the dyadic level. And then we have the study of social capital, which is a lot of sociologists, for example, and economists. They're studying the benefits that we get from one another, this social capital. And there's a very, very rich body of literature out there. One very prominent book on social capital is called Bowling Alone. And that's Robert Putnam's book, and it describes how a lack of social capital might be tied to places, like third places, like bowling alleys and movie theaters. And it also describes how important social capital is for us. Then we have the social network, which is a configuration of relationships that sociologists have also been studying since about the 1920s. And these social networks have skyrocketed recently with new data from sources like Facebook, where people are using really, really big data to look at how many hops it takes to get from one friend to another, who's the most centrally located person in the network, who is, when somebody is very, very popular in a location-based social network, what are the rules that will determine how many friends they'll have. For example, Katy Perry has the most Twitter followers last time I checked, and she's a lot more likely to get a certain number of followers every single day until it saturates. They can actually measure these types of things. But we don't have any geography in this kind of sociological and communication studies. It's totally missing, even though it's a really rich body of work. So we need to put geography into it. We should spatialize the dyads. We should take a look at how these dyadic relationships are embedded in the environment. We should spatialize social capital. Each of us has this topology of relationships, all of us, that everybody we know is in another place right now, and we each have a certain map in our head, and we can actually map it, of where our social capital is. Where can we go crash on somebody's couch? Where will we call someone if we were in the same conference together, etc. All of this sort of exists in our minds right now, but it doesn't exist on our maps yet. And then we have the spatial social network. So it's an extra level. It's not just our social capital, but we have friends that form little cliques and little pockets in places. And I usually explain this to my undergraduate students is, if you go to another place, you might have a lot of friends there, or you might have a lot of friends who are connected, or you might have a lot of friends who are disconnected. It makes a difference. And the way I explain that to them is that if they have a lot of connected friends, they're a lot more likely to be able to organize a GIS intervention for you and tell you that you're doing too much GIS. So the way that the spatial social network is configured is also really important. We don't really study these things here very much, but we could. The way we study relationships is a little bit more on individual communication and movement patterns, especially movement patterns. So GPS traces, where people might be going and if they're going together. We could link these individual communication and movement patterns to more of a motive. So instead of just saying, oh, you have a GPS trace that's going somewhere, oh, Clio came from Penn State down to Texas State, you want to know who's at that destination and what types of relationships are being helped by that movement. This is sort of a meta example. So socially connected linked communication and socially linked movement are important as well. And then these are the way that we typically, as geographers, study relationships, is aggregated all the way up to giant origin-destination matrices, which we call OD matrices, of our global movement patterns and our global communication patterns. So that is typically how we get this data to work with. We typically get especially global movement patterns. So those are our flights, those are train passengers going from place to place, those are commuters, migrants, etc. So this is the level that we're typically working with right now. But I think that you can disaggregate it and learn a lot more about how interpersonal relationships are actually the pieces that bring together these puzzles up here. So today I'm going to talk about some initiatives in these three over here, because these are the realms I'm most interested in. But we're going to start out with some social flow theory, which exists over here. So first, social flows and social distance. Here's a table that is a typology of social flows, and this came out quite recently. We decided that if you're dealing with spatial networks, you're usually dealing with a lot of spatial networks that are planar. That means that they're embedded in the geographic space. And that's really easy for GIS analysts to work with because we can do our spatial joins, we can do our buffers, we can do the things we typically do in GIS. But there's a lot of non-planar flows as well. So our travel, our telecommunications, and then our relationships too. And the way that these are different is that they don't necessarily show up in GIS ever. the way that they're generated is typically more agent-based, so they don't have rules like a hydrological system might, they don't have some rules like a power grid might, or like different roads might have them, they don't have that upper level directive. You can change the data by deciding not to go to the movies. You can change the data by not taking a flight, etc. So it's really important to have these typologies for us because importantly, a lot of times these things, especially these type 2 through 8, just show up as a line in the GIS. So we don't know whether that line is a fence, we don't know whether that line is a text message that went from one cafeteria to another. We're not sure. So we needed a better system to understand this. So here are some examples of what these data tend to look like in geographic space. We were looking at, for example, AM flows of commuters going into Singapore, and we learned some interesting things by mapping these out and visualizing them as spatial networks. For example, we learned that in the docks in the industrial area down here, there were a lot of workers who ended up living in this district right here, and then we learned after that there were company buses that took them back and forth. In this example, these are phone calls from Orange did a data for development challenge, and they gave out phone call data for Cote d'Ivoire, and they let us map it and take a look at how the different phone calls were going from place to place. So this was really interesting for us. The thicker red lines mean that there are more phone calls going from one district to another. The loops here mean that there were a lot of internal phone calls. And we had thought that when this data came out, that we were going to see a lot of calls going here to here, and then a lot of calls going up here to here, because there had been a north-south civil war recently, and the area above here is more Muslim, the area down here is a little bit more Christian, and then this area has a different type of industry because this area is landlocked. That's very, very typical for a lot of these countries. So we were really interested in seeing that a lot of the relationships and a lot of the flows were still going north to south in this system, and over here as well. And it was because mostly they were benefiting from the economic system. That was the ports here brought in all the money, and the economic system was still prevailing, even though the North-South Civil War had occurred. So that's what these phone calls could tell us. I also have students map flows in GIS a lot. And so this is an example of mapping remittance flows from the World Bank. And this was from last year. They were interested in taking a look at the countries that were on the banned travel list. So the World Bank has matrices of how much remittances go from country to country, and they're free and they change them every year. They're downloadable online. So they were tasked with finding out whether there was more money flowing in to the countries that were on our travel ban from a couple years ago, or money that was flowing out from the countries. So this was a student map, and these are showing exactly where the countries that are receiving a lot of money from the other countries are, and how much money they're receiving. This is in millions of dollars. So this was showing that 4 countries were really, really highly taking a lot of money, and a lot of people were sending remittances back to these countries. And vice versa, with this map, again, the students were interested in making a lot of these maps. This is a student map. And showing that the outgoing remittances, so the remittances leaving these countries, were a lot less. And they played a much smaller role in contributing to the global economy, or a much different role in contributing to the global economy. However, there were some still remittances flowing, for example, from Libya back to some European countries. And the extent of this, although it did stay pretty locally, it did have some really interesting patterns. So looking at and mapping remittances is a way for us to understand interpersonal relationships. Remittances are very family-oriented. The biggest day of sending remittances from the US to Mexico is on Mother's Day. And remittances sending back to Africa from the US, they most typically send them to siblings, for example, because they are the people taking care of parents. So remittances are a way for us to get at interpersonal relationships. So the next section I'll talk about is social distance. And this is where I delve into a little bit of history. So we define social distance as the dispersion between two or more places as measured by the inverse of the magnitude of social flows between the places. So you just take 1 divided by the full number of flows going from place to place. So if there's a lot of flows, the distance is small. If there are many flows, the distance is high. This was first described by regional scientist Walter Izzard in the early 1960s, coming out of this kind of J. Forrester sort of operations research and dynamical systems school of thought over at MIT in post-World War II. And he used the example of Hollywood and New York having very, very strong connections, even though that they were on 2 different coasts. And he attributed that to a lack of intervening opportunities, and saying that even though those places were really far away, they had a very small social distance because there was a lot going back and forth. And this quote was on 1 page of a 500 and some page book on regional science, and it just takes up a paragraph. And so when I saw it, I was like, wait, this is a really big idea. We should do more with it. And since then, people have been calling this different things. So they've called it functional distance, measured by social contacts between places or individuals in 1982. Effective distance, measured by following flows on an infrastructure network. Or logical distance, which measures the dispersion between towns in terms of labor or study-led activities. So with these types of resurgence of this same concept, looking at it from epidemiological models, for example, we're still using the same concept of social distance as it was called in the 60s, but people are sort of renaming it because it makes a lot of sense, but they don't necessarily have a common lingua franca with which to discuss it. So just as an illustration, we have a Euclidean distance between 2 places, we have cost distance, and then we have our social distance. And a lot of that has to do with moving and information flow. So I attempted to try this for Austin, and I attempted to take a look, and this is completely conceptual, it's definitely not citable, it's sort of empirical, but we decided to take a quick look at how we might measure social distance between 2 points I and J by taking some sort of constant, let's pretend it's 1, over some sort of parameterized model here, A, B, I didn't agree, all right. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, where would be parameters, you have an error variable here, and then we took, so the number of commuters between 2 places over the sum of all the commuters. The number of migrants over 2 places over the sum of migrants. Number of flights between 2 places over the sum of flights. And then the tweets, we had some tweets too. So this is sort of like a toy model, a conceptual model of how you might measure social distance. So we got some data, and we tried to do this for Austin. So we first measured the places that are closest in Euclidean distance. And the argument here is that these aren't necessarily the places that are having the biggest effect. And if you're wondering what these are, we had to do it at the CBSA level here, which was the old MSAs, the core-based statistical areas. But then when we look at the nearest cities for commuter flows, these change a little bit, namely because the population is higher in some of these cities, so they send more commuters here. And we just pulled this from the census data, from Census Lowe's LEHD data. Then we took a look at the nearest cities for migrant flows, and this is from IRS data. And this is looking at, these aren't directional, so you can either come in or you can either leave. But the cities that played a big role in sending or receiving migrants from Austin, these were the top 10 over here. And then we also looked at we looked at flight data. So where were the destinations for flights? And these do look like hubs, I know that. And you can either go to the DOT website, it's called RITA, and download a lot of transit data. And they say that they're not hubs. They say that the hubs are different, that will count the layover sometimes, or will count just the destination. They did say that they counted just the destination here, but it looks suspiciously not like that. And then these are the nearest cities for Twitter flows. So this means that if you are tweeting, and you tweeted in one place or another, you say, we thought you traveled there. And then this is one experimental one. This is called Gowalla data. This was a really popular spatial social network, and the reason it's popular with researchers is because it was one of the only ones you could download from online. And the Stanford Snap data actually hosts this. So if you want to mess around with social spatial networks, Gowalla is big. And it was like Foursquare, but Foursquare was a lot harder to get social network data from. So if we added these all together and we ranked them, et cetera, we could find the other core-based statistical areas, the other CBSAs, that tended to have a lot of interaction with the Austin CBSA. So again, we went back and we ranked them, and we just found did the average of the ranks. Again, not empirical, not citable, but a thought experiment for us to see what kinds of cities actually had pretty high interaction with places. And it turns out that, for example, New York, there is a lot going back and forth there, and Atlanta, and then obviously other cities in Texas. But it's cool to think about how our information flows and how we flow and how that might not be right next door. So these were the flows outside of the Austin area that where the commuter flows are obviously quite local, but the distant flows are not as local. So depending on the flow type we're using, we get a different picture of how cities are interacting. So that's social flows and that's social distance. Next, I'll talk for a little bit about spatial networks. Spatial social networks are my favorite, so I put it here. So social networks in GIS. The first thing we have to do for this is decide what you want your nodes to be. I call this an anthrospace. That name hasn't really taken off yet, but I think it will in the future. So you can say by your migration trajectory, your daily activity space, your real-time location, your home address, or some sort of administrative locale. I will say that home address is usually the most common way to map nodes in a social network. Usually they have that. And usually if you're being a responsible mapper, you'll jigger that a little bit or put it to a nearby intersection or something. And then you have to decide where your edges are going to be. So your edges might be telecommunications data, evidence of a tie from self-report. That's very, very popular too. Giving a survey saying, who are your friends, who are your family, tell us about these things. And there's some more ways that are a little bit not self-reported, not self-volunteered, like things like shared bills, or like things like social media friendships if they're volunteered. So once you have this social network, you can do a lot of fun things with it. You can look at basic geometries, which is how the dyad is put out in geographic space, so where these relationships exist. You can take a look at node roles, so this like blue dot might be the more popular people or the most central people in the social network. The yellow dots might be on the periphery. And then you can look at what kinds of places they tend to hang out in. So if you're very, very popular, do you hang out near the nightclubs or downtown? I don't know. So you can have modules here too. So there's a lot of community detection metrics and networks that physicists and computational scientists have developed excellent ways of cutting up networks. And then you can look to see where these modules are. This is really great for detecting ethnic communities, communities that might share language or some sort of other homophily trait, even like college students. They tend to have a lot in common, be close to each other, and live close by too. And see if people who are in similar networks also live near each other. And then the last one, which we don't have a lot of case studies for, but I still think is very important, is diffusion. So if something diffuses from a focal node, which might be this dark, big blue node here, how will it go? Is it gonna just diffuse Euclideanly? Not a lot of things diffuse Euclideanly. So how will it actually bounce around if it diffuses through a network? So we have some really fun case studies to look at with social networks. This is a social network of households in the Amazon collected by anthropologist Paul Hooper. And he was really, really kind to let me borrow this data. Apparently he was down there for 2 years. His wife got really bad stomach aches, and I was really, really grateful that he let me borrow it. But when we looked at it, so each household represents, or each node represents a household, and each edge between the household is a hospitality relationship where they had each other at their homes to share a fermented milk drink, which was a big cultural aspect in this remote village. And so the directed nodes up here with the arrows meant that they went to each other's homes. The colors of the nodes here was after we put our modularity on it, our modularity algorithm detected that these were the major 3 groups in the network. We didn't tell them to pick 3, it picked 3 on its own. And then we wanted to see whether there was any sort of spatial connection between these modules. And originally when it was mapped, we saw that there weren't because we were only using Euclidean distance. But when we put the GIS layers underneath it, we saw that there was a water body in between here. And so the water body was actually cutting up these households, and we could see that the modules that were created by the social network were actually played out in geographic space too. So that the households that were tight in the network also were neighbors with each other. And that, by being able to put the social network in GIS, we learned more about the people and we learned more about the place. This is a project that is just starting with the social network that we're really excited about. This is my grad seminar. We are so lucky to have Dr. Dan Delaposa, who's a new researcher, or a new professor at Penn State, and he's done a lot of work with the mafia. Not personally. He's done a lot of work with old photocopies, that's an old word, photocopies of FBI reports from the 1950s and 1960s. So he actually went to the library and he coded all of the known associates between in the FBI report. So they had someone's name and they had all the known associates of that person. He created a big social network with about 800 members. And he's got some really great papers on this. At the bottom here is an example of one. And he told me sort of in passing, he's like, yeah, I have address data for all of them, but we never used it. And so I got very, 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 very excited. And not only does he have address data for them, but he also has the place where they were born and what part of Italy they migrated from, if they had done that too. So we're currently looking at the household addresses for these people. And again, this was in the 1960s. It's about 800 people, 1 woman. That's interesting. And we're looking at what kinds of ties they have and whether those types of ties are somehow dictated by the environments that they're in. And this data is very messy. So here's an example of New York. The color here is just the distance of the ties together, and it's very preliminary. But the dots are their household locations, and the lines are just if they're known associates between each other. So generating research questions for this has been really, really interesting. It's mostly descriptive data, but we're very careful because we know that if we were to give this to somebody who wasn't interested in what it actually was, wasn't interested in the topic, they could apply some really basic metrics to it or some really fancy metrics to it and not really get the most out of it as possible. So we're trying to put a lot of GIS data in there to know whether they live in the suburbs or in the inner city, whether they're connected with people close by or far away, etc. This is another example of a social network that is almost done. And this was part of a social network that was collected by hand by survey through a snowball sample, meaning that you start with one person or a couple people, you ask them to tell them, ask them to tell us who they know, ask those people to tell us who they know, et cetera, et cetera. So this was collected by my former PhD collaborator, and he mapped all the household locations in Kabale in Uganda. And over here is a park. So it's like a parkland. And they wanted to see what the economic development was. These are, the ties between them are employer-employee relationships. So who was able to get somebody a job at the park, which is very important for economic livelihoods, obviously. And whether being nearby somebody or whether being in the same village was an issue, or whether they went out to other villages, and also who the central person was, who was really, really, really important in getting those people those jobs. Were they also centrally located, or were they near the entrance to the park? So saying, are the people who are very important in the social network also in key spaces in the geography as well? Or do those things not really matter too much? And then this is my last example of a social network. So we often build social networks from call data records. So the last couple that I showed you were examples where of people. Well, most social networks are of people, but of smaller social networks where you actually interacted with the people. A lot of times we also use passive data to infer social networks, and cell phones are actually a really good way of doing that, given that there's privacy involved. So this is an example of people. Each different dot here is a different person or a different cell phone, and then this was a project we did in Singapore. And so each different color and each different shape is another person. And so we can see their, quote, activity spaces, the places that they tended to go to within a month's time. So we could see whether they went around the whole island or whether they were confined to a pretty small space. And then we could draw very, very, very rudimentary activity spaces around them. By rudimentary, I mean there's a lot of ways to draw activity spaces. And you can do homework, you can do sort of the barbell method, there's a bunch of ways of doing that. This is a very easy way of doing that, and this is called a standard deviation ellipse, which is set to capture most of where they're going. So for example, this yellow triangle person, had two major neighborhoods that they spent a lot of time in. Most typically those are home and work. And then they had some other places that they hung out in, and this is when their cell phone is pinging the cell tower. So that's how they know that they're there. This blue person here tended to not have as high of a trend, but they got around to different places as well. And then this orange person here, they tended to stay in their neighborhood a lot more. So these are different examples of how the social network, or how the GPS traces or the cell phone traces are actually showing us the activity spaces. But then we also know what other people that they call. So that's the social network aspect of it. So we can ask the question of, are people who are friends are calling each other, do they inhabit the same spaces? Do they hang out in the same spaces? Do they live in the same spaces or work in the same spaces? So this is an example of what came out of this, just visually. And so this is showing the darker circles, the A, B, C, D, E, are one person. We call that an ego. And then the circles or the oblongs, the ellipses around them are all the people that they called in that time. So from this we can get out a bunch of different typologies of people like C over here who had very, very similar activity space or very similar trajectory of all the separate people that he may have called. Or that he SMS or she SMS during the time. There are some caveats with this. In Singapore, the cell phone penetration rate is about 2.2. Meaning that people have multiple cell phones, which doesn't seem to be as common in the US, but it still happens. The teenagers in Singapore always like to have a separate cell phone for their parents and one for their friends. I never understood that because I can never keep one phone straight, but it's a thing. And then we also see that some places like A here, the people that he or she calls, they have wider range of mobility. They have a wider range of mobility, but he or she exists here at the epicenter of all of them. So maybe it's easy for them to see the people that they call as well. Also, interestingly, this shape over here tends to follow the east-west MRT line, which is the subway down there. So that's also overlaid with important transportation infrastructure. So we're doing new social spatial network methodologies. For example, what's the expanse of a social network given the most efficient one? We're looking at whether nodes play similar roles and also cluster in geographic space. The way we measure that are these factors here: closeness, centrality, betweenness, centrality, clustering coefficient, and degree. And those are different ways to measure how important someone is in the social network. And then how are intervening opportunities a metric of edge salience or edge inefficiency? So asking something like, how many people did you pass over to maintain a relationship with somebody? This is really cool to look at in business too, when you decide to do business with somebody, even though there are a lot closer options. And then finally, do community social networks, do they overlap, do they form cliques, do they extend, etc.? So I'm gonna wrap up pretty soon here. I'm just gonna flip over to my final slide. I told Sasha that I never am very good at deciding what to show, but.
So far, so good.
Okay. I have no tomatoes, right? Okay, so my conclusion is that it's really important to look at social flows and social distance, social capital in GIS, social networks, and also dyadic relationships in GIS. We need better research questions, we need interdisciplinary collaborations, reliable data, and more proof. We need more proof that these things matter. And I'll just close here with one of my favorite new maps I saw recently. Craigslist used to have a missed connections section. Some of you are shaking, nodding your heads, okay. And so they would say stuff like, hey, I saw you on the bus, you looked at me, and just here's my number if you want to call me or something. And these are the places, according to state, that these tended to have the places that they say, oh, I missed you. So in Texas here it's Walmart, which is a really popular place. Other places are Subway, like in New York, which is not Subway, it is the Subway. I wasn't 100% sure. Or in LA, people work out there a lot. In California, so that's the 24-hour fitness, which ostensibly you have to go back to because you're a member, or on the bus, in a bar, etc. So interpersonal relationships are all around us, and you GIS people have more fun with this. Great, thank you so much.
Questions?
Hi.
Hi, Sam. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about how you pick the, I guess, the individuals you used for the egos in that last example. So is it random, or is it like demographics, or how did you kind of choose those 4 specific people to look at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Usually when the cell phone companies or when cell phone people will work with us, we need to know it's not a complete network. So we usually do randomly sample, but we tend to ensure that they're not on the periphery of the network. So that means that people are both calling them and they're calling people. So yeah, it is a random sample of who are the egos and who are the alters on that one, yeah.
A lot of the data kind of leans towards dense population areas. Did you do anything where you actually looked at the density of the population, of the number of people that go back and forth, rather than the whole number of the population being communicated back and forth?
You mean for the social distance aspect?
Yes.
Yes. So that one, not necessarily. It wasn't like what percentage of people are actually using this. That would end up with something different. This was more of something like if you wanted to see how something would spread epidemiologically or something like that, or knowing demand for travel. But that would be a really interesting economic question of something like if this town wasn't available to you for some reason or for evacuation or something like that, what percentage of that town would be affected. So that would be a good way to do it.
Other questions?
Yes.
You can go back to the slides where you show us using Austin as an example for the social distance.
Sure.
Remember that you look at 4 different kind of data, including the migrants, flights, Twitter, and that was the last one there.
Oh, I thought about this right now. Yeah. Oh, am I going to go through all these? Hang on. Yeah, I'll find it. I'll find it. We'll be good. Okay, let's zoom back up to the front here. Okay. Yeah.
We don't actually see what you project.
Oh, thank you. Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, can you show us the formula when you...
The fake formula?
Yeah.
Sure.
I know this is still work in progress.
Okay.
But from the map that you show us later on, I do notice that the flights, air travel, and the Twitter, actually, I think the pattern looks a little bit different. I guess that may account for maybe how different data sources may capture different types of travel, or maybe even different population group. that reflected those data. So maybe if you can comment a little bit on what those data mean, or the population that can be reflected from those data,
Sure.
and maybe from this preliminary work that you're working on here, how maybe we can tap onto other data source to represent other population groups to make this a more comprehensive model.
Yeah, so that's a big question. So one example that we use for this is like the difference between people who are very tech savvy and people who might be on the other side of the digital divide. So for example, the big South by Southwest conference. So we might be looking at what kinds of people are being drawn to that type of thing from the tweets and things that are going on in that month in March. Versus the community that's coming in to be freshmen at the university. So those would be the people that may be taking flights or might be driving in early August. So looking at the spatiotemporal differences, or just the temporal differences or the mode of the flows that they're using can tell us a different story. But let me answer your question a little bit better. So are we asking like how the actual formula would change or how the equation would change or?
Well, I'm just wondering, how you may elaborate a little further about the population group that may be represented from each of these data sources.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
There's maybe something bias in each of those, and maybe from there, your future plans on tapping onto other data sources that may represent other population groups that you might not have fully capture in this existing.
These are only the public data sources that are available. So in terms of private data sources, that's a really good question. Are you asking if we might have phone calls or something like that? Or if we're interested in migrant populations that are coming from outside of the US?
Either private data or other data that I guess from you also show us the cell phone data in Singapore too. So I assume those data may be more sensitive.
Yes, exactly. In the US, there's been a lot of other cell phone companies that have been a little bit more interested in sharing their data than US cell phone companies, like AT&T and Verizon. One way of getting around that right now is that there are companies popping up that actually partner with the cell phone data. So one of them is, a really prominent one is called AirSage in Atlanta, who partner with Sprint and change up their data, the Sprint data, and then use that for origin destination flows that can be used here. Another one is SafeGraph, which uses, they're based out of California, and they're using people's app usage. So when you download an app like WeatherBug, for example, which is not, or I'm not sure if it's around anymore, but a weather app where you have to know your geolocation, they're using a bunch of different apps and aggregating them to show how people are moving. And those would be much better data sources, hypothetically, than the ones that are public. Especially here with the IRS data, we had to stop early in 2012 because the IRS gives us migrant data every year by county. But after 2012, they switched the method, and from 1990 to 2012, it's one way, and 2012 and beyond, the data doesn't match up. So we're really at the mercy of a lot of these public data sources. Yeah. Okay.
So data is one of the big problems, right? In terms of what you can collect
Yes.
and produce a network in terms of origin and destination
Yeah.
flows.
So not necessarily knowing the biases, not knowing how valid the data is, a lot of issues pop up there. Yeah, definitely.
So the question that you have there is supposed to separate the components, because as you put it there, my impression is wrong. In terms of what you have.
Yeah, it's not a formula that should be used.
Right.
It's a formula that explains Walter Izzer's old concept from the 60s, which was, again, just a tiny little paragraph, and how big data, how are we going to get all these big data sources to fit into this concept that makes a lot of sense. But how exactly are we going to do that? How do we parameterize these different things? What parts of it do we use? This is a really open research question.
Yeah. And the open research question today is, are you willing to sacrifice your time to create a new, more actual mafia?
That's
Or sacrifice your life, I don't know.
Great, great.
Okay, I just want to let you know that we will have a reception at the hallway, and also we have a happy hour starting at 4, the great 4-hour host, so please join us. And well, lastly, we have our acting chair, Dr. Julian, to present Clio, our geology goodies.
So this is the this is her 5th colloquium this semester.
My favorite.
But she said it's at lunch, she said it was her most memorable. Now, part of that had to do with Sasha driving the wrong way on a one-way road. But I think the reason is because of all the people here. So I don't want her to forget us. So take this. This is your new bag. There's coffee cups, shirts, everything in there. So this is our thank you for.
Thank you so much.